And then I'm going to hand the baton over to Josette, who I have known
years now.
How many? Almost a decade. In probably 2 or 3 career choices back in terms of history when you were at UC Davis, the World Food Program.
Just 2 ago.
And then was Katie, huh? And then?
Katie was before UC Davis. So I've had a diverse career in ag. I did 16 years with the federal government working at USAID on international ag development. And then I worked doing business development for an ag biotech company in Davis, Arcadia Biosciences. Then I worked at UC Davis, something called the World Food Center. Then I worked at the Environmental Defense Fund and oversaw their sustainable ag program. And I've spent 6 years now at the Almond board. There you go. So 2 jobs ago.
Diverse background of
30 years in ag. I'm older than you think I am.
To all kinds of industry-related things.
Yeah.
So
great. Well, it's great to be here.
And now you've heard the audience. I'd love to understand.
Yeah.
So what's
all right.
What's
I'll try to touch a lot of things that you guys have an interest in. All right. So maybe just a little bit of background on the industry. We are the largest crop in the state of California by acreage, and I think it's second or third by value after dairy and sometimes wine grapes. We might be right up there with wine grapes at the moment. It's about a 500-mile span of growing almonds in California, so from Tehama all the way down to Kern County, so from about Chico to Bakersfield, to south of Bakersfield. We produce 80-some% of the world's almonds here in California. So we are the almond producers in the world. Australia is our number 2 competitor, and then after that, Spain and Portugal make up the balance of about 20% total. Why are we so dominant in almonds? One is we have the largest Mediterranean climate in the world here in the Central Valley. So it's an exciting Mediterranean. You have to get in the Mediterranean mind when it's 110 degrees down there, which is just the same as it could be in the south of France or the south of Italy. So think of it as being a little more exotic than we normally think of it. So almonds really can only grow in a Mediterranean climate. The tree blooms in February. That's a very sensitive time if we have frost. So you have to have a climate where you don't have frost risk well into the spring because of the bloom that happens. And then you need the crop to dry in order to harvest it in the summertime. So you can't have humidity, you can't have rain. So like Australia, where they have this very narrow band of a Mediterranean climate, they tend to get a little bit more rain sometimes at harvest, and that can very significantly impact the quality of the nuts. Spain and Portugal, which are on the Mediterranean, are actually a little farther north than we are, and so they have much higher problems with frost risk during bloom time. So one reason that we grow so much of the world's supply of almonds is because of our natural climate. The other is that we're not competing against any low-cost producer in the world, and I would challenge you to think of anything that we grow here in California where we're not competing against a low-cost producer in the world. It's not that cheap to grow almonds in Australia, Spain, or Portugal, so we don't have that problem. And then the last reason is that it's a highly mechanized crop. There is not a labor constraint like you see in a lot of fruit trees and vegetable crops. So those are the reasons I would cite as to why we have so many almonds in California. It's an interesting industry because we have a lot of small growers. 70% of almond growers in California farm 100 acres or less. You can have a day job and grow almonds on the side, and in the evenings and on the weekends you take care of your trees. They're not that high maintenance, and there's a lot of contract service providers that can do, if you need pest management spray, you can call PCA. There's custom harvesters, so you don't even have to have the equipment to harvest your crop. So that it's unique in that we have a very large number of small growers. The further south you get, the larger the average farm size is. From about Merced north, the farms get typically a little smaller. You have many 4th and even 5th generation almond growers in the state because of that. We have about 100 processors that manage that process the entire crop. And I should say there's really kind of 3 segments of the industry. There's the growers, and then the growers pay someone called a huller and sheller to do just as the name implies, take off the hull and then take off the shell. And that's a contract service. Or there are many cooperative hullers and shellers that are owned by growers. So there's this sort of middle segment. The nuts are still owned by the grower, and their nuts are completely segregated through this entire system in wooden bins and even in stockpiles as they're waiting. So there's really strong segregation of just your nuts. Because they are paid at the next stage, what we call handlers, who are the processors, who do all the rest of the grading and sorting, and the grower is paid on quality. They're not just paid on yield. And so that has to be segregated throughout the system so that just that grower's nuts are graded and then they're paid based on their grade. So kind of 3 segments of the industry. What else? 2/3 of the crop that we grow is exported out of the United States, and I'll talk about where those go to, and about 1/3 of it is consumed domestically. It is the top agricultural export from the state of California by value, and it's the top specialty crop exported from the entire United States by value. It's a pretty high value product in this. So these are some of our major markets. So exports can include Canada and Mexico. India is actually the single number 1 export country that we send almonds to. There's a huge historic cultural consumption of almonds in India. It's given as gifts. It's a premium product for gift giving, and many parents feed their children a certain number of almonds that have been soaked before they go to school every day because it's thought to improve mental acuity. So there's a lot of cultural tradition associated with that, and we are the number 1 ag export product from the entire United States to India. We are the number 1 product, so not corn or soybeans or anything like that, it's almonds. So India is number 1. After that, in aggregate, Europe is sort of our 2nd largest export region. China here, we are exporting fewer almonds to China than we used to because of tariffs. It started 2 administrations ago. We've had retaliatory tariffs on China, and they've slapped tariffs on a lot of agricultural goods, including almonds and other nut crops. So that's declined a bit. We also have markets in the Middle East, and some in Latin America that are much smaller in size. One thing that's really important to understand for those of you who work in the pest area or maybe in detection of things is that because we export to some very sensitive markets like the European Union and Japan and South Korea, very sensitive to things like minimum residue levels of pesticides on the kernel itself. So we have to comply with very stringent regulations, and as Europe tries to move more and more away from certain pesticides, the MRLs of what we might use for pest control here tend to get lower even if they use different pesticides for production within the EU. So we do sampling of almonds every single year from throughout the state, multiple samples, just so that we can internally monitor whether we are staying within the MRLs in important export markets. Aflatoxin is another really big issue for us from an export perspective. Right now, Japan tests every single shipment of almonds, and if they detect aflatoxin, they make the entire shipload come back. So it's very expensive. We're about ready to agree to new protocols with Japan, which would be a huge thing because it's been very costly for the industry. In Europe, we actually have negotiated what we call a pre-export check program. So we can run certain protocols to look for aflatoxin before the shipment leaves, and that way when it gets to Europe, it's unlikely to. Yeah?
When you say we test, is it the farmer testing or is it a government agency?
So that's a good question. The almond, and feel free to ask questions as we go on. The Almond Board of California is what we call a federal marketing order. So we exist under regulations by USDA, and they oversee everything we do. But it does give us certain ability to act in a quasi-governmental way. So one really great example of that is we have mandatory pasteurization requirements for all almonds sold in the United States. If you buy them at a farmer's market or a farm stand at small volumes, they can there's a waiver for the pasteurization. But we had problems with salmonella in almonds about almost 25 years ago. As a result of that, instituted a mandatory pasteurization requirement. There's a number of different technologies, but we oversee that. So we have to certify labs who are conducting the pasteurization, or facilities that are doing the pasteurization. We have to certify those. Like I said, we do actual testing ourselves. The pre-export check program for aflatoxin is based on protocols that we developed, and there is some monitoring that we do of the companies that then use the pre-export check program. So we can exist in a kind of quasi-governmental capacity. All right. I threw this up here because another issue that's important to us is we are a discretionary food product. We are eaten as whole commodities by people. I'm sure all of you have eaten your share of almonds. And so we actually care quite a lot about how the consumer thinks about how we grow almonds. We also care how California policymakers think we grow almonds, because our sort of social license to operate in this state is dependent on being seen as a good citizen. So we recently put together this sort of infographic that distills a lot of different environmental messages. We fund a fair amount of peer-reviewed scientific research on environmental issues around almond production that is behind this. And we try to have a very high standard of being seen as a credible source of information, so that it's not just market claims. We're also overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so they insist on a high standard. We have to cite where we get the data, and it has to either be a scientific publication or a government agency. So just some examples of things that are important to us. It's too small room. So I'll talk a little bit about this. Water is obviously, I would say, the Achilles heel of the almond industry. If you're here in the state of California, you may have heard, we were once, and there was a Mother Jones News article during the last really bad drought, 2015-16, that says it takes a gallon of water to make one nut. Yeah. And that number has haunted us ever since. So we're working really hard on a whole bunch of areas around water, which I'll talk about. But we also like to get the message out that we don't waste anything. So I'll talk a little bit about our co-products. We don't call them byproducts, we call them co-products. So around every almond is a shell and a hull, and every single one of those goes to use. So shells are used as livestock bedding, and hulls are used as dairy feed. And because those hulls are used as dairy feed, we save an enormous amount of water, an estimated 440 billion gallons of water a year that would have been used for alfalfa to feed those dairy cows here in California. We've done a lot of work in the industry to promote adding on-farm habitat for pollinators. Another area where we're criticized a lot in the media in the past has been around bees, both honeybees and native bees. So we've done a lot of work to encourage growers to add pollinator-specific cover crops, as well as to add pollinator habitat outside the orchard. We're very proud of our carbon footprint in almonds. It's a very low carbon food. You can see we're lower than tofu, which has got to be your quintessential healthy food product, right? The state actually, and that's the carbon footprint. We've done 2 life cycle assessments of almonds, and that's based on our peer-reviewed, published LCA. The state of California also now recognizes the amount of carbon that is sequestered in orchards. When the state is doing inventories to set priorities for where they're going to make investments to meet our state's climate goals, they've now started to include orchard systems as part of their carbon assessment. And you can see we sequester a lot of carbon in our trees. As I mentioned before, we have an enormous number of family farms, over 7,600 almond growers. 90% of those are family owned, and 70% are 100 acres or less. So there's a lot of things that we think about when we look at production of almonds and technology and research that is behind being able to say these things and also to continue to improve on these things. All right, so if you're really interested in almonds, you just need this one slide. So we fund about $5 million a year of production research on almonds every year. And all that research is overseen, and I think you can make these slides available if anyone wants them. I see lots of phones. Yeah, this is the slide you need.
We've got this
So we have a committee we actually have 2 different committees of folks in our industry who help us set priorities for what research we should fund. So these include growers, they include processors, they include pest control advisors, cooperative extension specialists, commercial nurseries, irrigation supply companies, and they help us set priorities, and we revisit those priorities every year. And this is our current set of priorities for almond research. And I'll try to highlight a few things. Up here, again, because of export requirements and MRLs, because we farm here in California where we highly regulate pesticides, and there's pressure to on using fewer and fewer pesticides, we have an all systems approach to try to finding new tools for pest and disease management in almonds. We currently have a very interesting program that Pam back there in the back helped us get going, to do third-party trials of commercial biopesticides. So we fund 2 contract research groups, and we had done a solicitation to anyone in the world who wanted to submit products for testing against our priority pests and diseases. From that, we had a committee of folks who helped us select which ones to trial. And this last production year, we did our first trials, mostly focused on fungal diseases in almonds, which start at bloom time and go all the way till harvest. And so very excited. We have a couple of products that look very good in that first round of trials, and we'll be tweaking the protocols and starting a second year. I envision we would do at least 3 years of trials in multiple locations. In that first approach, and then our plan is to work with Cooperative Extension, who do a lot of on-farm research for us, to then help us start to look at how to integrate these products into conventional IPM systems. So obviously biologics are great for organic production, but we're also very interested in them for conventional production. An interesting point is that in almonds, less than 1% of our production here in California is organic. It's very hard to grow a tree organically. It has a very high nitrogen requirement, and so you trade off a lot of tree growth because of the high cost of nitrogen fertilizer. So not a lot of organic production. So that's an example of biological pest control. We're not funding the products themselves, but we're funding the trials and the work to integrate them into conventional systems, because we want growers and pest control advisors to have a lot of confidence in these products. And if you do come to our conference next week, you'll see we have a lot of credibility of the research that we fund and the way we disseminate it to the industry. So they really do look to the Almond Board. If we're putting out information on how to use something or showing you what works or doesn't work, that tends to have a lot of credibility. So that's the goal, is really just to help close the gap on skepticism around these kinds of products. We actually just started funding a GMO insect project in our industry to develop a sort of sterile version of our top insect pest to use in a sort of sterile insect technique. But this is using a genetic engineering trick to get the sterility in the insect, as opposed to treating with irradiation, which is the classic method. And that is with a private company based outside of the United States. Remote pest monitoring. We have an interesting partnership with a company called Semios, which started in specialty crops in California, which is super unusual, let me just say. We never get anything starting in our crops. And this company has a whole suite of different technologies, but they've since acquired a bunch of other companies and have a new name. But what we did with this company is we funded a lot of research in the public sector. And in this particular case, we had degree day models for some of our plant diseases that are important to almonds, fungal and bacterial diseases in particular. So these are degree day models, which are a pretty common tool for being able to assess risk of different disease outbreaks. And this was all run out of, the technique for doing this was a faculty member at UC Riverside developed these. And we make them available, they've been published, we've done training on them, they're on our website, but to be honest, probably a lot of people don't use them because it means you gotta stop and do some weather analysis and plug things into these calculators. And Semios automated that, and they have weather stations in orchards as part of their service that they provide. And so we funded a public researcher to basically run the models using Semios weather data, and then we, in exchange, so Semios got a free bit of information from this faculty member, and in exchange, we were allowed to publish disease risk in almond growing regions. So they were able to share the information back. So it's another example of how we can work with private companies to bridge that gap. Varieties. It's a fascinating world. I didn't hear anyone here on the genetic side of it so much. We grow 80% of the world's almonds, and our top variety is well over 120 years old. So we're not very sophisticated on the crop genetics side. Breeding in almonds is very rudimentary. We have 2 public breeders in the entire state, and there's probably about 3 private breeders. And most of the commonly produced varieties that probably represent 75% of the total acreage are basically varieties that were found on the landscape. That someone saw a tree along a railroad or down a road and it looked pretty cool and they tested it out, and those are our major varieties. One of the interesting things genetically about almonds is they're naturally not self-compatible. So they have to cross-pollinate with a different variety. It's a natural genetic barrier that exists in almonds that doesn't exist in our closest relatives, peaches, plums, and other prunus fruits. As a result, most orchards, if you drive by them, there are at least 2 different varieties. And you can sometimes see during the springtime, they might bloom at slightly different times, sometimes they have different architecture. That means you're actually having to do at least 2 harvests, so that's pretty costly from a labor standpoint. It also means you're probably trading off some yield because you're farming to the dominant variety, the one that has the highest price, which is this one that's over 120 years old. So you're probably not farming as well for your second variety. So development of self-compatibility in almonds is a huge breakthrough and was done through classical breeding. There's in Europe, they discovered a naturally occurring almond tree, again, kind of on the side of the road, that had a mutation in some of the genes that are responsible for this genetic barrier. We now, just about a month ago, learned there are 2 companies that have developed gene-edited self-compatible almonds. So gene editing is a huge potential boon to a crop like almonds where breeding is really difficult, and has not yet delivered a lot of really good varieties to us. So another example there. Things that I'll talk about. So anyway, I can talk about any one of these. I'm going to give you 2 more examples. Off-ground harvesting, this is an interesting thing. So the way we harvest almonds is there's machines that come and shake the trees. The almonds fall to the ground. They dry naturally on the ground for a couple of days, and then there's a second set of machines that sweep them into neat little rows in between the trees. And then a third machine picks them up off the ground. So they dry in the sun, basically. It's costly to have 3 groups of people going through your orchard over time, and if you have to do that twice, that's at least 6 passes in your orchard to harvest your nuts. And it's so funny to look at different industries. Prunes don't harvest they harvest them off the ground. Pistachios, they harvest off the ground. So why is it taking us so long? Well, it is. But we now do have commercial equipment that can catch the nuts from when you shake the tree, and then either put them directly on the ground in a nice neat row, so you eliminate that middle step, or in theory you could haul them out of the orchard and mechanically dry them. But there's not sufficient facilities in California given the incredible amount of almonds that we produce. On a good year it'd be 3 billion pounds. So right now mechanical drying is not a good option, but we have done research on that, and we know that it reduces pesticide residues, aflatoxin, and you get a much higher quality nut that way. So I'll give you a couple other more use cases that are high on our list. So pests and diseases, really, really big. We have the most amount of research we fund in this area because it's very costly and it directly impacts quality. And again, quality is king for a product like almonds. So I'll start down in here. Technology that can improve the precision and efficacy of applying conventional pesticides. So the way this is done right now is with what's called an air blast sprayer. If you go around orchards right now, you've started to see these machines come out. And this is a diagram that shows you the effectiveness of application of pesticide on a tall tree. I mean, a mature almond tree, easily 20 feet tall. I'm sure even taller than that. So you can see here 15% coverage at the top, 50% in sort of the lower but top part of the canopy, and it gets lower and lower. So this is really poor quality coverage for the tree, and that's really important for our number one pest, which is an insect that is attracted to when the hull splits open, and there are plant pheromones that are released that attract this insect, and they lay their eggs at the suture of where the shell closes. It's a lepidopteran pest, and it goes, the larvae, when they hatch, go into the nut and start consuming the nut, and that becomes an aflatoxin entry point. Hull split, when those hulls split over, it starts at the top of the tree. So you're getting really poor coverage at the place where the tree is the most vulnerable to this pest. So this is a huge area. It also, we have pesticide risk, pesticide drift, which is regulated here in the California. It's a problem that is a reputational risk for us as an industry. And again, the cost and lack of efficacy. So really interested in new hardware and software technology that could improve the efficacy of coverage. And then I'll come over to here. This is the same insect pest I'll talk about, navel orangeworm, or now. We've also done a ton of research, 50 years of IPM research on the single pest. In fact, one of my predecessors at the Almond Board got his master's degree paid for by the Almond Board in the early 1970s on this insect. So we know a lot about how its life cycle is. Typically, there can be up to 4 generations in a single growing season. And this tracks different types. There are different types of traps using different types of lures. So there are pheromone traps and egg traps, and those are mapped on here. And what you can see then are the red line is the females, the females, adult females. And you can see the first emergence and as we go along. This particular year, this is actually data from 2023. What happened this year is that if you're an entomologist, it'll make sense, the phenology of the insect pest, its timing of when it was emerging and laying eggs was different than the timing of the tree's life cycle. So typically, while there are great tools like traps and degree day models that growers could be using to time their sprays so that they apply the product at what we call hull split, this really sensitive time, which I think in this year was this dotted line. Very few people use that. And so what people just say is, oh, when you get to a certain percent hull split, then you spray your tree. Well, this year, when you did that, you waited to hull split, you just used the tree's signal that it was time to spray. You sprayed too early and you missed the effectiveness of the residue of the pesticide. So it contributed to higher rates of damage from this pest, and that damage has very significant consequences to what you get paid for your almonds at the end of the season. So this is a great example where we have tools, but they're a little complicated to use. And if you're, if you got 50 acres of almonds, you got a day job, are you really gonna like go at night when you're tired and do these calculations to figure out when to put your products on? Probably not. So this is a great area for improved software and hardware, automated traps that have the ability to detect insects, run those degree day models using weather data, to give you a simple decision. Is it time to spray or not time to spray? That would be a great area of innovation.
Are there like regional indicators for farmers so they don't have to do the math themselves?
So there are some folks in cooperative extension who will publish, they'll run the degree day models for their region and then they'll publish that, but it's not done consistently across the entire state. So companies like this one, Semios, that I mentioned, that runs the degree day models or uses their weather data to help the faculty who run the degree day models, they have the ability to do that for you, but you have to subscribe to their service. Yeah.
So 2 questions. Wouldn't the person who prescribes the spraying,
Yes.
wouldn't they be the one that says you need to spray now or don't spray now?
Yeah, so in theory, yes. In practice, probably not always. The pest control advisors who a lot of growers do pay in order to advise them is fraught with, maybe not always being the most thorough. Those pest control advisors, again, we have a lot of small growers, so sometimes they may be in a hurry and they gotta get out and service a lot of folks, and this is a 500-mile range. I spend a lot of time in my car driving up and down this valley. So they don't always, the timing can be off as to when they can get there. Okay. And there's also a little bit of cover your butt. We learned this when we started looking at data on another insect pest, web-spinning spider mites, which are a problem in almonds late in our season. Super easy IPM tool. It's a yellow sticky card and you count the number of 6 spotted thrips on this. I can count to 6 spotted thrips and I'm not an entomologist. They're visible to the eye. You don't even need anything special. And if you have enough of them and there's a very clear threshold, then you shouldn't spray because you got enough biological control. But if we look at pesticide application records, which you can do in California because every grower is required by law to submit their pesticide use information to the state, we see that basically every acre of young almonds is sprayed. So sometimes people do stuff because the pest control advisor was hired and the grower says, oh, but I got whole split, you should go out and spray. Or it's May, you should spray. So these kinds of, misinformation can persist. And if a grower, if a grower is paying someone and the grower thinks you should do something, then sometimes the pest control advisor will just do it.
The second question is the machine that sprays.
Yes.
So is it owned by, does each individual grower own the machine, or is it a cooperative that owns one machine? If that's the case, then when it's time to spray, wouldn't like 18 farmers come in and say, I need the machine today?
Right, so there's very little cooperative machine ownership.
Okay.
I'm not really aware of much at all.
Okay.
So it's either that the grower owns it or the person they're hiring to apply it owns it. And that gets, again, you might think it's time to spray, but if you can't get your guy that you're paying to come out, then you're kind of.
Or he's already sprayed somebody else's.
Yeah, no, he's busy doing something else because there's, again, we have a lot of small growers. This happens a lot at harvest too. We know that if you harvest your crop on the early side, you reduce your navel orangeworm damage because each flight, each generation is a logarithmic growth curve and you're more sensitive at the end. So if you could harvest like here or even here, you're gonna have lower damage rates. But if you are a small grower and you have to pay a custom harvester, they might not be able to get out to you in time because they're out harvesting other people's almonds.
time scale is weeks, so it's really fast.
It is, yeah. Okay, here's another sort of case, water. After pests, water is one of our primary inputs, and it's an area that can be very costly, certainly if you're in the southern part of the almond growing region where you may be paying for surface water, or you're paying for energy to pump groundwater. It's also a reputation issue for our industry because we're considered to be using a lot of water. So we fund a lot of different research in this area, and some of it exists in the public sector and some of it exists in the private sector. So what's been interesting in the last few years, there's been a number of companies that have tree-based sensors that measure the plant's water status. So stem water potential is what SWP stands for. These are all commercial technologies. We actually funded some folks at UC Davis to trial all of them against the gold standard, which is something called the pressure bomb. That is another way of measuring the plant's water needs. So we, again, kind of a third-party evaluation. We didn't say this is the one you should buy. We just said here's the data, that how it compares to the gold standard. You can decide what's right for you. And so that was one way in which we can try to get growers to be more confident in paying for these. That alone won't solve the problem because these are relatively expensive pieces of equipment, and you'd have hundreds of trees per acre. And so which trees are you going to put it on, right? So you can't put one on every tree. There's no way. You might look at your soil maps and say, okay, well, I have these 2 or 3 different kinds of soil on this one block, so I might choose to put 2 sensors in the different soil types, but that's one element. We've been working with a consortium of folks from USDA, UC Davis, NASA, to develop a suite of 6 different models that allow a grower to use satellite-based information and calculate their actual evapotranspiration. And so what this does is it's using this public satellite data. There's a website that you can go to, and we've calibrated those models for almonds. And again, it's a suite of 6 different models. And the goal of that is that now there would be a really highly reliable way to get actual evapotranspiration and see the variability across your individual orchard on a regular basis. I forget what the resolution is of the satellite imagery, but it's pretty high and it's quite frequent. So it would be very useful. It's a big improvement over the old system that the state runs. If you are in the irrigation world, it's called ETC, and there's SIMA stations, and the state helps pay for a system that's not very accurate. This is way more accurate. So that would be another great input to help improve the precision of your irrigation management. The challenge we're now facing is, well, how do we get the private sector to take this up and sort of spit out easy to use information to a grower rather than having to go to a website and log in and look at your patch and get the information yourself? Could it just be packaged alongside a whole bunch of other information that you use to manage your irrigation system?
Is there any interfaces with that, with real integration, with real irrigation systems?
No, not right now. So a lot of area for opportunity there.
They want it.
They would
Yeah.
want that.
We want it. Growers don't know about it yet because it's still been a research project.
I was going to ask you some of the questions.
Yeah.
Just, I know you guys are actively trying to get growers to move away from flood irrigation, but
Oh, yeah.
I guess a lot of irrigation I've seen doesn't appear to be as precise as that.
So-
Matt, is that something,
Yeah.
there's a hardware.
It's a hardware and a software thing. So we actually have moved off of flood irrigation. So I think 90% of almond acres are on either double line drip or micro sprinklers. So there's a few left obviously, but very little is flood irrigated in almonds anymore. The challenge of getting more precise is both being able to see the variability and measure it more accurately, but then it's also going to be a the controller side of it. So like here, if you can see the variability in your yield, but you have a single pump that turns on and off the entire block, you can't manage the variability. So the cost of the technology to break big irrigation blocks down into smaller parts is a key thing, and it's not so cost effective right now. We have to retrain irrigation system designers, which is an area we are quite actively involved in doing outreach to, because they're the ones who set up those systems for growers, and we want them to understand all of this as well. To get to real precision, you want to manage to yield, and the way we currently harvest, where we shake, drop them to the ground, and sweep them all up, there's no yield monitors on our equipment. As we start looking at off-ground harvesting, where you collect the nuts, it's very conceivable to add a yield monitor that maybe looks at the yield of, say, 2 or 3 trees at a time. It won't get to the single tree anytime soon, probably, but we're already seeing opportunities both from public sector research, but even one company that makes off-ground harvesters has started to put yield monitors. So that will be a big thing, is then you say, well, okay, I have variability, maybe the soil types here, I'm always gonna get low yields. Why bother to put more water, more nitrogen on there, because that's really costly. I'll just accept that that's the low yielding part of mine, and you can make decisions like that. And again, the controllers is a huge part, so a hardware component and a software component to eventually getting to this level of precision. So getting towards the end here, so how do we work? I've given you some examples. We have a lot of information on how to grow almonds. I think probably 50 plus years of research. We know a lot about most things having to do with growing almonds. We have a lot of contacts, whether it's you want to do some on-farm work on almonds, or you want to know who's a cooperative extension specialist you could talk to learn more about a particular problem in almonds. We have a lot of contacts in our industry that we are happy to be helpful to. We fund research, and we fund research both with public sector and private sector. So we are able to give grants to private companies. We can connect companies to people who know a lot about almonds in the public sector. I gave you an example of Semios working with this plant pathologist at UC Riverside. I also gave examples of third-party assessment of commercial technology on the water sensors. That's an area where, again, we're not trying to judge companies. We're not going to give a seal of approval to one and not another. We just share the information that comes out of those trials. And the whole goal is to give growers confidence in making a decision to use technology that works. We haven't done any prizes yet for companies, but that's something we would consider. And John has raised that question with me. And then I'm going to wrap up with an area that isn't about growing almonds, but about the other things we grow with almonds. So that should look familiar. Again, around every almond is the shell. This is a hull. This is the outer coating of the almond. It's actually equivalent to the part of a peach or apricot that you eat. It's just much thinner, and as you can see, by the time we harvest it, it's very dry. But it's very high in sugars and phytonutrients, and it's currently all going into the dairy feed industry because it is such a high quality thing. We actually have work going on right now to get it approved for use as a human food, and are exploring the market potential as a way to add fiber into food products, to have an upcycled ingredient and sustainability story, and there's also some potential formulation benefits. And then we grow a lot of wood. We don't prune almond trees after the first couple of years, so it's just whatever branches that need to be, that are maybe diseased and need to be removed or fall off in the wind. And then at the end of the life of the orchard, you have anywhere from 20 to 30 1,000 tons of wood that you take out with the orchard. So we actually have a research program around biomass use or co-product use, because we're looking for higher value and more diverse co-products from hulls, shells, and the woody biomass. And we've done a lot of things in this area. We've funded a lot of research projects, and increasingly are moving away from just funding research and really trying to figure out how do we stimulate pre-commercial activity. So just some examples of things we've done. We have done a market assessment that looked at a whole lot of different uses of almond co-products to try to figure out how to prioritize some of our work. This is all information I can share. We're actually funding a small startup company out of UC Riverside that has a technology to take almond, or they take pulp, started out in cannabis, and now is using almond wood. And we've done 2 rounds of grants to this company to develop an alternative to nylon for use in clothing. They were actually originally introduced to us by Patagonia. This is the use of almond hulls as a food ingredient. We've worked with a private food development company out of the Bay Area called Matson. And they did some analysis on the almond hulls and looked at a bunch of different product concepts. This is one adding it to sort of a Cliff Bar type product. And you can see there the dietary fiber content goes up from, what was it over here, 19% to 39% in a single serving using almond hulls. And it has a good flavor profile. And then more recently, we were looking for partners that are more on the economic development side of things. This is an organization out of Modesto, that works in the northern San Joaquin, trying to encourage the circular bioeconomy. And so they have a variety of sources of funds, and they do work with universities, as well as they're trying to work with startup companies. So they recently had announced a range of grant opportunities for companies to try to further their business in this region. So we partner with them and probably will be working with them on an accelerator program to help fund startup companies using almond biomass. So those are kind of some examples of things we've done in this area. And I think I just have a couple more resources that if you want to learn more about almonds. We just launched this thing called the Almond Learning Hub, and it contains a bunch of course material. They're not necessarily courses for you all, but yeah, they're courses that were designed for pest control advisors, growers, other people, that you can get a lot of information on, like what about a certain pest, or how do we manage irrigation, all gory detail. There's an extensive course catalog, so Almond Learning Hub, you can just Google that and you'll get top hit will be this thing. And then on our website, almonds.com, we have a ton of grower resources, information on the industry, and so it's also a great way to learn more about it. And there's my email address, and I have a few business cards, so.
Thank you.
So we'll open up for questions from the audience.
As I should say, that's almonds in a nutshell.
It's still a gallon of nuts.
It is,
Okay.
but we do get 4 crops for that gallon, and all those crops have some value, so, yeah.
I guess on that note, I know the Almond Board was working on some efforts to restore groundwater. Is that still?
Yeah.
Do you think you could offset that?
Yeah, so we were really a pioneer in promoting groundwater recharge on almond orchards. We funded work, I think it's about a decade ago, at UC Davis to look whether you could flood an almond orchard during the winter time when winter rains might make water plentiful. Almond trees go dormant during the winter, and we indeed showed that you can safely flood an almond orchard. And so groundwater recharge is an area we actively promote. We have resources on almonds.com on how to do that. We are now starting to work with irrigation districts to get them to solve any remaining problems, to help growers access water during the winter months. And I was just preparing for a talk next week at our almond conference, and I know that in one area of the San Joaquin, between 2017 and 2023, groundwater recharge increased 90% in that period of time, and about 2/3 of the total potential for replenishing in that aquifer has now been achieved through groundwater recharge. So that's an area where we can show we're trying to be part of the solution to more sustainable water management.
Well, you have the acreage and the delivery systems
Exactly.
already. You know.
Yeah, I mean, the delivery systems aren't perfect because they're not necessarily, I mean, we don't have flood irrigation anymore.
Yeah.
So some farms actually have to add infrastructure in order to be able to deliver the water to the farms. And some of that can be quite expensive depending on what your system looks like right now.
Is there a risk of moving nitrates?
Of groundwater, yes, of flushing them into the groundwater, yes, there is, and we have research on that to try to help mitigate
How do
that.
you prevent it?
Part of it has to do with how much you flush at any one time, so that you don't get all the way down to the groundwater. You might move the nitrates in the soil profile, but not all the way down to the groundwater. So that's one way to do it. Certain soil types are better suited so that you don't have as high a risk. That's another way.
Just like you and I had talked before this meeting about the almond board getting involved in uses for almonds and the early research you've done in almond milk. Are there other innovative
products?
uses?
Yeah, so actually we historically have never done research on product development. That has been the competitive space of our almond processors. We actually did no research around almond milk. That was developed without any input from us. But because almonds are now facing more global competition in the plant-based foods, in the plant-based milks, I think almond milk has definitely taken a chunk out of the almond milk market. Almond milk is still the #1 plant-based milk, but oat milk has impacted that. So we've now, based on a big market assessment we did with Deloitte Consulting year before last, we are now have permission from our industry to look at what we might do in the area of new product development or new development of new forms of almonds. So that is an area where we actually have a task force that's just got started and should wrap up probably early in calendar 2025, and that will initiate potentially new kinds of research, and particularly I think interested in commercial research to develop new almond forms or new uses of current almond forms. Almonds are sort of from a food product side, I would say almonds are the #1 nut in terms of new product introductions around the world, because it's such a versatile nut. It doesn't have a really strong flavor, so it can pair well in a lot of different forms. It's very shelf stable. It has a 2-year shelf life. And we already have a lot of forms of it. I mean, almond flour, every sliced, diced version of almond you can imagine. Almond protein powder, which was taking technology from cocoa production and using it to sort of defat and compress almonds into a powder form. Almond oil is a new version of, and there's now historically almond oil is made through sort of more refined almond processing, where nuts that were so low quality we couldn't sell them could be refined into almond oil. It's part of zero waste. There's almost no throwing out of almonds, like in the entire process, down to the consumer. Less than 1% at the consumer level, which is pretty staggeringly low. But now there's people doing, because the almond protein powder squeezes out the oil, there's now really high quality, sort of extra virgin type almond oil. So yeah, we're gonna get into the food product world.
COVID had a big impact on the profitability of a lot of growers because of supply chain issues.
Yep.
Are you seeing consolidation?
Not that much. So yeah, we had 2/3 of our crop is exported out of California, pretty much most out of the Port of Oakland, some out of the Port of Long Beach. And during COVID, when you couldn't get ships, we had a real problem. We developed a huge inventory. It was also the year of our largest production ever. So double whammy of problems there, and it's really only now, all these years later, that we've made it through that inventory. So we're in a pretty good place, and the prices started to go back up. So there's expectation it'll continue to rise. Almond growers were not profitable for 2 to 3 years in there, and we saw that in terms of some people having to sell off acreage. The people who had to exit the industry first were the investors who had purchased almond acreage and were running it as a pure investment. We've seen one of those go out of business, and they were a large growing operation. There's not a lot of corporate farming of almonds, but that was one that did go bankrupt. We've seen, some selling of acreage This is the second year where we've seen a slight decline in total acreage. Probably having to do with the low prices combined with SGMA, the groundwater regulations that will impact the ability to access irrigation water if you're not on irrigation district, which some of our acreage in the south definitely fit in that. So we've seen a slight decline in the acreage, but to be honest, it's not that much.
What's on the horizon for any of the newer self-pollinators? Are they becoming better than the independents?
Yeah, so Independence was the first self-compatible or self-fruitful almond variety, as its name sort of tried to imply. But it turned out the quality wasn't as good. And so that acreage sort of topped out at about 20 to 25% of the total in the industry. There was a newer variety, Shasta, that looked better. The trees have some problems with them. They tend to be leafy, and so you can break branches and you have a heavy load. There's a new USDA variety that scored very well in the regional varietal trials that we run. So we run trials where we run them. UC Cooperative Extension runs them, and we pay for them. And we make the data public. So they scored well from an agronomy standpoint and from a taste and quality standpoint. So that variety seems like it'll be pretty popular. But when these two gene-edited varieties come out, that could be a game changer because there are dominant non-Perel varieties that they've edited. So we're entering the brave new world there of figuring out what that means from an export standpoint.
There was a court decision this week.
Yes, I
about
heard.
genetic engineering.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that impacts?
So we're hiring a consulting firm actually to help us map out the regulations on gene-edited products in our export markets, because even if it's not considered a GMO in the United States, if it is in Europe, that would be a problem for us. So the court case, as I understand it, has a big implication mostly for products. You don't get to voluntarily choose whether you consult with USDA to find out if you're regulated. You have to consult with USDA to find out if you're regulated. Whereas USDA had streamlined it and said, if you make these very small edits, don't worry, you don't have to come to us. They're not regulated here in the US. Which these gene-edited almonds would have fallen into that camp. The first company to get their product moving actually did consult with USDA, and that's when it became public that this was out there, because USDA makes their decisions public. That was just in the last month. So the particular changes will not impact the two varieties that are under development that we know of, because they are really small edits. One of them's already been through the consultation, the other one will have to do it, but it will still not be considered a GMO in the United States. But the key thing is, what is it in the rest of the world? Yeah.
Can you tell me what type of work has been going on with the shell?
Yeah, so lots of different things have been tried over the years. So there was a USDA researcher down in Parlier who did some really interesting work to use shells as a remediation for groundwater quality. And I forget what it was remediating for, but that was one, and they were just raw shells. At UC Davis, Allison Mitchell had a really interesting project using shells to clean water coming out of wineries, so that they don't have to put it into those tail ponds for as long, because that's very expensive. You have to have a lot of land to have these ponds to clean up that water. And so just one of the projects that came from the Resnick funds looked really promising, using shells to clean up winery wastewater. There's been quite a bit of work around torrefaction and pyrolysis of shells for various uses. So these are two different ways of burning under controlled conditions. Learn a lot of things in this job. So some interesting work from USDA that showed torrefied almond shells will strengthen recycled plastics and improve their, you can make plastic pallets with them, for example, and various other plastic things like black plastic, basically to be stronger. We haven't seen anyone go to commercial use of that yet. Pyrolysis, there's a company in Merced that has a proprietary pyrolysis system, and they use almond shells to produce specialty chemicals. It seems they haven't totally found a use for those chemicals yet. They are marketing them as...
Coragen?
Coragen, yeah. They are
coragen.
marketing them as pest control or biostimulants, but they're not planning to register them as a pest control product, so.
Is that a byproduct of the pyrolysis?
No, it's sort of their primary product, and then biochar is a byproduct at the end, and they do sell the biochar. Let's see.
Nut jobs?
Yeah, which is now called Almond. There's a company that won the Shark Tank program at Western Growers a number of years back that has a bioplastic made with untorrefied, so just ground up almond shells. And their initial market they were targeting was the nursery pot industry, which you might not know, like California, I think the nursery industry is in the top 10 agricultural commodities in the state. Like, we have a huge nursery industry, both for commercial production as well as for retail. And so there's a lot of plastic pots. So that's one market. They just recently hired a new CEO. We really hope there could be some biofuels companies that would come out, because that would use volumes and would really offset our carbon footprint, so we'd be like carbon negative as a food. But I haven't seen any of those quite yet.
Our initial research was on walnuts,
Yeah,
and we found pretty good success with walnuts, up to about 20% use. But
for what purpose?
for soilless.
Oh, for soil
For soilless
application.
substrates.
Oh, okay, cellulose,
So-
okay.
Right, so instead of wood fiber.
Right.
Or redwood or
Yeah.
Douglas fir or
Yeah.
whatever. And then, with the pistachio, we're having really great success.
Good,
And so.
with the shells, yeah.
Repurposing the shells.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, like 125% increase. We actually think we could use every pistachio shell in California.
Good, because they don't have a place to sell them.
Exactly,
We got at
exactly.
least a place to take them. They're not a waste product that a
Exactly.
huller sheller has to deal with, and they get rid of them right away because they're a fire risk too. So
Right. But-
yeah,
but
but pistachio is a harder one.
But the almond
Good.
still,
Yeah.
I have, we haven't tested the almond yet, but
Yeah.
it's still the same.
Well, we can
conversation.
hook you up to get some if you need them, because we're good at contacts.
And
We
root stock.
ship almond hulls, shells, and woody biomass all over the
Perfect.
place to try to get people to test it. One of the things we did with this regional economic development organization in the San Joaquin Valley was Circular. We worked with a organization that does feedstock reliability ratings around North America. And so they looked at biomass from ag in the northern San Joaquin, a 70-mile radius is their methodology. And we got a AA rating for woody biomass, which is mostly almond trees, a few cherries and apples and walnuts. And I actually keep getting their ratings as they come out. It's the best, it's one of the best woody biomass ratings in all of North America, because our biomass is all concentrated alongside the 99 and the 5 freeways. Whereas if you're doing forestry biomass, imagine how hard it is to accumulate that into something that you have to take down to the processing. And we already have equipment that chips all of this, and you can just haul off the chips. So that's another way we try to raise the visibility of the investment opportunity in the biomass area.
You said that one thing that characterizes the business is that it's highly automated. There's an exception when it comes to knocking mummy nuts out of trees.
Yes, yeah.
And the only mechanized solution that I've seen is some
That gun.
kind of, it's like a pea shooter.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah, they yeah, you get a lot of, well-meaning people who have interesting ideas. Yeah, there was a company and they bought space on our expo floor and showed their technology at our conference. I don't know if they were there last year, they certainly were the year before. Yeah, absolutely difficult to imagine that's economical. What I've heard is the probably more realistic solution to that, well, one is chemical. So we do actually have research trying to look at abscission agents, which are like what's the word? Plant hormones that would break the junction between the nut and the, so these are used in the walnut industry. They're used in apples. It's
You
not
don't
an
want to do erythrol on almonds.
Yeah, well, the problem is, in the past, they've never shown to be very effective, but we do have some new research that suggests it's a question of dosage and timing, so there could be some opportunities there.
It causes less fruitfulness the next year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, worked with it for 40 years. and
Okay,
Everybody
so
tried it.
that's one area. The other is, I have heard of some large growers, like a company name called Olam or OFI, Olam Food Ingredients. What they've used is I think it's drone imaging to identify if there are sort of trees that have heavier loads that is worth sending a harvester out to shake that tree. So the biggest tool we use for navel orangeworm control is what we call mummy nut or winter sanitation, where you go in and you reharvest trees so that you have less than one mummy nut per tree. And that way you reduce the overwintering home for that pest and you sort of flatten out your curve populations at the start of the season. So it's not very high tech in the sense that you're just basically saying, well, which are the ones worth shaking? I'm not going to send a shaker into the entire orchard. Maybe there's a patch that's worth doing it.
I'm going to make a mention, something that is coming out, I think that'll be very interesting for everybody. For years, we worked on trying to get chitin, which is from seaweed, but it's concentrated. It is registered now on almonds and some of the stone fruit. It's very effective. It's for sizing and for holding on the nuts, and especially the ones that don't get totally fertilized, I mean, it's a really nice tool, and of course, it's been an area of what I've worked in for years. I've worked with a lot of these new biostimulants that have a PGR type effect, but they also do added things like increasing sugar transport and cell division is one thing, but you got to fill it with something with carbon and protein. So there's a number of new biostimulants that are out. Bill and I have been looking at it for about 12 years that are finally coming out because everybody's coming out in the open, and once they get them registered as biostimulants, I think you'll see. Bill and I've had success for years, anywhere from 20 to 30% yield increase in that 1-2 applications timed typically with the fungicide. So critical timing. So it when we saw the acreage getting pulled and because of the water and all that kind of stuff, I thought, this is probably the moment where sooner or later biostimulants are going to be very popular in the almond industry. And there's several of them that are available.
Yeah, I mean, we do know a lot about tree growth patterns and carbohydrate mobility within the tree, and there are trade-offs of nut filling versus woody biomass growth. How many blossoms it puts out, because there just frankly aren't enough carbohydrates to go all around. So definitely a lot of interesting baseline information to pull from. But yeah, I mean, we recognize there's probably some really valuable stuff in the biostimulant and arena. We just haven't gotten into testing those yet, but probably in the future we will.
The off the ground harvesting, I haven't seen that up here much. How many companies?
You haven't seen it much anywhere, to be honest.
I only see it in pistachios.
Yeah.
So
it's been a function of
that?
cost. So if you're not profitable for the last 3 years, you're not buying a $300,000 new harvester. Is the answer to that. There's several good options on the market now. Part of it too is, unfortunately, there was a Spanish company that developed the first. They brought harvesters from Spain, and the trees are quite different in Spain. They tend not to be very tall, and so this off-ground harvester, which like literally goes over the tree row, kind of like an olive harvester or grape harvester would. It really distorted a lot of people's understanding of what this could look like, and it kind of tainted the whole area for a while. And then an Israeli company came in and developed a harvester, or adapted their harvester specifically to California orchards. Again, our trees are a lot bigger than Israeli almond trees tend to get. And so that one is commercially available. And interestingly, the organic community has moved a little bit faster because they have problems with weed management, and they tend to till their soil because they're trying to get the nitrogen from the cover crop into the ground, because it's hard to get enough organic nitrogen to grow a tree and a very high protein almond.
Yeah.